All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for having me here. So I'm Willie Poh. I'm from Malaysia. So I'm from one of those countries where religious opinions and religious ideas is taking a very strong creep into the rule of law and so on, as our previous the president of IHEU said. This coming August, there's actually a huge Supreme Court hearing about an attempt to describe the Constitution of Malaysia and the human rights provisions within as not applying to people who are of a certain religious faith in the country, right? So actually, humanism, the atheist and the humanist movement in the country is in fact very wide. We have a lot of members, but we don't have a registered organization like the Philippines, for example. So we are still mostly a social organization, which usually meet up every now and then. So what I'm actually interested to talk about here today is about the topic of education. I think that's part of the reason why Rick actually asked me to come as well, based on what I have previously talked about at TEDx. But since I'm in front of a humanist audience, perhaps we can talk a little bit more about how education actually contributes to the whole idea of humanism. So when I was thinking about the title, I was trying to come up with something interesting for mostly humanist audience, right? So I thought the word faith would be very appropriate in there. So I used the Hitchens definition of faith, right? Or the usual atheist definition of faith, which is belief in the lack of evidence. And the reason why I think some faith is necessary, at least for myself, in education, is the fact that it is still an open question whether education is in fact making a difference in terms of the thinking of people, and that it can actually change with the times. So nobody questions the fact that education is actually perhaps the best way to raise somebody's economic status in their own society. But the question of whether education is actually fulfilling what it's supposed to do is still very, very much out there. And when I talk about education, considering that I'm a university lecturer, so I come mainly from the perspective of formal and higher education. So this is the quick outline of my talk, why I'm in education, the good and the bad of it in the current status, and some small things I think needs to happen in the future for us to be able to move forward. So why I'm in education. When I was a high school student, secondary school in my country, I was a very good student. I got really good results in standardized testing, national standardized testing, and so on. But I never quite loved my education, so to speak. I always had issues with the way, how rigid the whole education system was and so on. So when I actually got into university, I was expecting things to change, right? I was expecting a place of free inquiry, debates with lecturers, exploration of ideas, and so on. When I actually got into university, and I found out it's the same, regardless of where you actually ended up going, unless you went to perhaps one of the top universities in say a Western country. But even then, having spoken to students from those universities, I'm not entirely sure that is the case. You get something like a high school experience, just with more difficult topics, right? And a lot of people actually reflect on the fact that sometimes university is actually slightly easier than high school. So I think that has been an experience with a lot of people as well. So me and my friends, when we were in university, we were talking about what exactly we're doing with our lives and what exactly that actually matters to us. And I came up with this general idea to get the conversation rolling most of the time. If you take the basic life cycle of a human being, you usually get this. Like if you talk about the basic number of things which everybody does exactly the same way, regardless of what they believe and whatnot. They are born, right? They grow up, they get an education, they get married, they have kids. Most people have kids, some people don't, but they generally have a family, and then they die, right? I put an X there because I couldn't find a nicer graphic which doesn't have this connector. Right, smart art in PowerPoint, very easy. Right, so how is this actually different from, like say, a monkey, for example? So I came up with another graphic which, yeah, myself and my university friends were basically talking about the meaning in life and all this kind of things, the kind of conversations you expect 17, 18-year-olds to have at the time. And this is what we basically came up with, right? So the basic human life cycle compared to, say, an animal's life cycle. You can put a bunch of different words to the actual chart, right? But you're essentially talking about the same thing. We use the word education there for humans, but we might say observe adults for an animal. Instead of the beautiful word marriage, we say find a mate. Sounds a lot more barbaric. Instead of saying having kids, we say they breed, you know, like, ugh. But if you look at the patterns between the two, you're essentially talking about the same thing. We are life on Earth, right, essentially. Or creatures on Earth basically go through the same cycles most of the time. So at the end of the day, if we find that the basic things that we do every day actually fits or does the same thing, what exactly will it be the factor which actually differentiates us from animals, right? So speaking to a humanist conference, I'm sure everybody here have actually asked and have your own answers to this question. But this is the central idea which I think a lot of people do not think about when they go about their daily lives, right? In essence, a lot of people grow up and they get an education and they get a job and so on, and that is the cycle which society tells them they have to do, right? So whatever systems of beliefs which they go through life with, it is sort of given to them instead of something which they actively seek. So at the end of the day, the whole age-old question of what actually elevates the human race above everything else, anywhere else you'll hear questions like we were actually created by a creator in his image and so on. But if you look at reality and you look at what you actually can see around you, you will find that actually the differences narrows down to much smaller things, right? And the earliest definition in science for the difference between man and animals is basically tool usage, right? So we discovered very quickly when Jane Goodall went to the Congo and he discovered that chimpanzees were actually making tools out of twigs, tearing off leaves and using them to fish termites out of ant hills in order to get a snack. That actually told us already that tool use is actually prevalent in animals. We think of ourselves as creatures of culture. We differentiate ourselves from country to country and so on. And we think of ourselves as creatures which are actually able to solve problems that we see and so on. But we have discovered that actually animals perform similar things. They can adapt to different environments through the change of behavior. And we discovered that they can actually pass on this information within a certain scope of population. And actually the same species of animal may behave differently based on something they learned through observation of adult members of the species. So all of these things are not something which we can ascribe to differentiate humanity. The last thing is something which we think is true, but we can't prove either way, right? If we go up to a dolphin and ask them, hey, are you thinking abstract thoughts? You're going to get squeaks, right? The same way if you go up to a dog or a cat and so on. We don't know whether they think about love, or we don't know whether they think about all of these kind of things. So in fact, if you drill it down, at the end of the day, the main thing which actually lets us identify ourselves as different, and this is mine, perhaps you would call it something different, I think it's language. Because that is actually how you find out that the person next to you actually have a certain level of intelligence, they think certain level of thoughts which actually differentiate us. And if you think about it, all the other things comes out of this, right? Our ability to solve more complex problems, our ability to have weird types of culture, you know, force people to have strange beliefs by telling them certain things which may or may not be true. It's from language, right? And we are able to transmit information. We are able to transmit it across great epochs of time. And from there, we're able to collectively learn as a species. And on top of that, build a civilization. These are all things which are enabled basically by language. So an easy way to phrase the humanist question to people is, if you in fact do not add to this conversation, if you do not participate in the complex thinking and the language and the thought and the opinions that goes into framing what a human being is, and if you do not add to it, then how exactly do you differentiate yourself from an animal? So this was a question which we asked ourselves when we were university students. Now, as a lecturer, whenever I prepare a presentation, I always have to find something on Wikipedia to quote. And I was looking for whether anybody else in the humanist movement have actually framed humanism in similar terms before. And apparently, it's actually something which goes back to the actual definition of humanism itself. Today, we associate humanism with reason and free thinking and so on, but we also very strongly associate it with moving humanity forward, right? Doing good for mankind and so on. And this fellow called Gellius, I have no idea who he is, but he's on Wikipedia, so he must be important, from the 2nd century AD, basically he lamented that the earlier generations who actually knew how to speak Latin was basically not giving the meaning of philanthropy or advancing mankind to the term humanism. What they actually think of the word humanitas, which is the origin of humanism, is a meaning closer to education and training in the good arts, right? So the reason why these types of arts was called humanitas is basically because it is a kind of knowledge that has been granted to humanity alone of all the animals. The word granted is there because actually humanism has its roots from religion as well, in a way. So that is the reason, the idea that human beings are actually able to draw upon our faculties to discuss and to explore these issues, these greater concepts, to move ourselves forward as a civilization and so on. So basically, when you think about this, humanism is essentially advancing the greater good of humanity and reasoning only as a human can. So this is very core to what my own self-discovered meaning for humanism is. Before I actually knew the words like the terms of atheism and agnosticism and humanism, I actually thought about these kind of things in my own terms with the monkey picture and so on. So when I asked myself, so knowing that what exactly it is that I actually want to do with my life, this question popped up, right? So the idea is that if you are able to reason like only a human can, you should come to the conclusion that based on the evidence around you, based on what you can see, based on where you are in the universe and what you are actually capable of doing, then obviously advancing humanity and advancing reason would be the way to actually move forward. So a good example of somebody like who is actually doing this, whether he self-identifies as a humanist or not, is Elon Musk. The founder and CEO of Google has actually once said, with all his billions, he will rather give it to Elon Musk than give it to charity. Now, Elon Musk is basically the guy who founded PayPal and SpaceX and Tesla. And in an interview, he has mentioned before that people often wonder how he actually went from internet payment company to founding a company which wants to launch rockets and bring people to Mars. So this is what he said. When I was in college, there were 3 areas which I thought would most affect the future of humanity. Those were the internet, sustainable energy, and space exploration, particularly making life multiplanetary. Now, when he said this, I was jumping in my seat. I was watching this in my own room, downloaded video and so on, and I was jumping in my seat because these exact 3 things were the exact same things which me and my friends were talking about when we were university students. But what also strikes me very, very strongly is that these were thoughts which we knew we were having. These were discussions which we knew we were having, but we didn't have it because of the university. We were having in spite of the university, in spite of the education. And it was something which we didn't believe, which our fellows in the university were actually talking about at the same time. So if we talk about the interest to actually bring humanity forward, then you talk about what are the problems facing it, what are the bigger problems. You learn about the systems which govern humanity and so on. But these are not things which we deal a lot with in education today. We do not open up the discussion. We do not encourage people to think about these things. So why am I in education? Why have I chosen this career path? It's not because of money. There's a couple of professors and lecturers in the room that will tell you if you want to get rich, this is not where you go. Right? So the general idea is to actually find the opportunity to actually create the next Elon Musk, right? To prompt people to ask these kind of questions of the young generation. And of course, I don't want to have made a living before I actually start living the life I want to live. In my conversations with my friends in university as well, one of them actually believed that you should get as rich as possible, and once you have lots of money, you can actually come down and start doing things and making a difference. So I asked him, how much exactly is this amount of money you must earn before you feel you're ready to start? And he said 2 billion. I have no idea why it's this specific number, but that is what he said. So by the time you are a 2 billionaire, I don't think that you would be carrying the same idealism, the same belief in what you actually want to do, right? A lot of it would have been lost into a lot of these things. And entrepreneurship and making a difference for the world doesn't have to be something which is mutually exclusive. You can live a life and actually make a difference while doing it. But having said that, I have been in education for all my career, and it is something which I find challenging, right? If we're talking about creating the next generation, an admirable next generation which believes in making a difference in the world, then you're talking about creating thinkers, explorers, dreamers, not cynics, right? And to actually enable these kind of things, you need questions in education, not answers. You need openness, not rigidness and timetables and all these kind of things. You need opportunities for people to actually feel that they are contributing, and you need mentors, right? Not people who babble at you for 2 hours every day so that, you know, and scream at you when you're not paying attention to exactly what they're saying, even though you're boring them to death. Something like what I may be doing right now. So, are we doing this, right, in education? And when you go down to it and you look at all the questions, I find that there's actually a lot of conversations happening around education, but they're not always central to these big ideas. Now, I made this last night. The question of what education is actually supposed to do, when you hear people talk about advancing education, you most often hear about these two. Right, most of the national higher education blueprints, most of the people talking about advancing education, most of the people who are towing the line but making incremental changes are usually talking about workforces. But then you have those very few revolutionaries, people like Sir Ken Robinson, you know, who talks about actually how schools kill creativity and so on. They are talking about something else entirely, right? Getting people to actually explore the bigger picture of things, trying out all the arts and so on. So this is the question of whether we are actually creating better human beings who are actually differentiating themselves from animals, like we said earlier, versus people whom we plan to fit very neatly into society in specific jobs, right? So, and these jobs are slowly and very quickly being replaced by robots, right? So we are sort of training robots in a way. So if you talk about like transforming or changing education in incremental bits in order to actually improve how well we are teaching them so that they fit better for the workforce, then we're talking about making better robots, right? But because currently we're having bad robots. This is happening, right? This arrow, I put this arrow here because the conversation is happening. Let's train them better so that they can become even better workers, so that they're ready for the workplace immediately. But we're not talking so much about this, right? So every now and then you have a drop in the pool where somebody goes, or somebody writes a book, right, in defense of a liberal education, right? A writer called Farid Zakaria actually wrote a book about that. Every now and then you get a talk on TED about this kind of things. But so much of the conversation is centered around this. Not that these things are bad, and these things are good because it changes the pedagogy, it engages our students better, but not enough is said about this thing above. So if you look at the conversation about education, you see it from two broad perspectives. One is actually what drives decision makers in education, and most of the time you get things like this. So this is a Gallup survey, and even then, the conversation about improving the workforce is not actually a good conversation. We're not doing well in that. 96% of college principals believe their institutions are successfully preparing young people. 14% of their products, the actual graduates actually agree with that, and even less agree from the actual business world, right? So the reason for this is many. If you look from the university perspective, you talk about people who believe in teaching students fundamentals. Let's go back to the bare basics. And they want to cover foundational topics most of the time. So let's not teach them the cutting edge stuff or the things which will naturally plug into work, because we need to give them the opportunity to learn for themselves, right? So let's give them the bare basics. They are also very research focused, so this is dealing with a lot of abstract and theoretical stuff. And they often see themselves as knowledge brokers, the people with all the knowledge, and you're doling it out. Whereas this role has actually been replaced by the internet quite some time ago. If you look at the people who are actually hiring the graduates, they're looking for plug-and-play graduates. They want people with specific technical knowledge. But they always complain, ironically, that these people are lacking problem-solving, teamworking, and communication skills. So these are some of the biggest problems. And if you just enter a class in any university, you would immediately understand why. So it would not be surprising, right? And many universities are slowly changing this, but the vast majority of classes you walk into, you don't need a research or something to understand why it is happening. If you look at the learner perspective, on the other hand, and this is thankfully still a part of the conversation, you're talking about increased numbers of people entering higher education. You're talking about increased diversity in the classroom. You're also talking about the hitting of the next generation of students who think fundamentally differently from maybe all of us in this room, right? You're talking about people who half their brain is the internet, right? So if you don't know something, I can look that up. So why are you telling me this, and why do I have to write this in a paper to you? The challenge to them is not, in fact, getting information into their brains, but in fact presenting them with interesting ideas, interesting problems, and letting them find this information so that they can learn how to piece it together and apply the information. But that is not happening sufficiently in education. My favorite here is actually the one up here, right? They smile mostly to their phones, not so much on people next to them. So the other conversation that happens is about changing the student experience, right? The actual teaching and learning. So this is an observation which we have made. If you sit kids down, and university students are very much similar to this, doing low-grade clerical work for hours on end, don't be surprised if they start to fidget, right? So the learning experiences for universities across the world is still very much like this. The most common method of transmission of information is auditory. So it seems like the most convenient method to actually use, right? That's what we're doing right now. You're listening to me talking. You understand English. So that's the only thing which it links to in your mind, your understanding of the language. And you have to sort of figure out for yourself what exactly I'm trying to say, and it's not very engaging at all. That's why I'm using visual aids. So there's words that you can focus on the screen. Every now and then there's a picture in order to improve the quality of the presentation. But yeah, this is essentially what a student experience is like. Now for this, sometimes it works, right? In a room full of people who are actually purposely coming just to listen to what you're going to say, it's okay. But imagine if you are supposed to go through this. Most of you guys here are perhaps working adults. Some of you still may be students. Imagine if this is your work experience day in and day out for most of the days of a year. That is what a university student experience feels like. And we are trying to improve this. We're moving slightly, and this is actually the more common one. I call them contrived actual experiences, where people come up with elaborate schemes, games, and projects in order to force you to reach a conclusion that they wanted you to reach in the first place. But what we need more of are real experiences, right? The feeling that we can actually empower people to actually make a difference, even when they are students, to actually link what they're actually learning with solving problems in the real world. So, and this is also another thing which we often do. We actually separate out subjects instead of embedding them into the subject matter, right? So many universities have subjects like this. So where you sit down and you memorize a list of logical fallacies, for example, or you sit down and you memorize what are the steps in the scientific method. As somebody who is a huge fan of the scientific method, it is actually extremely depressing to watch colleagues and students sit in a classroom describing the scientific method to them. Why not you go out and actually do the scientific method? It's not that hard to find things that you can discover, right? So extremely depressing. Something to see. And people sitting in rooms teaching people about how to write business plans without actually talking about how to find ideas to actually make a difference in the first place. This is my favorite pet peeve, sitting down and memorizing a list of good morals and so on. I think in the Philippines, I checked, I think it's called good manners and right conduct here. So in Malaysia, we call it moral and ethics, right? So let's sit down and talk about moral and ethics for 2 hours for 14 weeks, right? So that's 28 hours of talking about morals. Which should not surprise anybody if it does not work. So despite all these things which people are trying to change in teaching and learning, the basic conventions always remain the same. Classrooms, subjects, courses, timetables, examinations, right? None of these things exist in the real world. So the problem, again, going back to that original thing is, all this talk, all these things that drive education and all these things that we're supposed to change in teaching and learning actually still does not address any of these problems. And that is the thing which I find basically the major problem that we are facing today in education. So how do we move forward, right? As somebody who is very tired, trying to push just a little bit the whole movement forward, if you break education down to its core, you basically get two big parts. One is the actual learning part, which is the reason why we do teaching in the first place. The other actual problem, which I think a lot of people don't focus on, is the question of qualifications. Why is this still the accepted method? Why are we still putting our 16-year-olds and 17-year-olds through a protected 3 or 4 year process to get them to calm down so that they are ready to actually start working? It's qualifications. It's not about the learning. It's because as somebody who is going to employ somebody in the future, you don't want to sit down and actually see what they've actually experienced, say over 3 or 4 years. You want somebody else to tell you that he has a 3.7 CGPA and he's good, right? So, and it is in this field that he's good at. So that is essentially the whole question about qualifications, and that's the actual thing that drives people to actually continue attending. I'm running a little bit out of time. So solving the learning problem is something which we're doing, right? It's something which perhaps was a little bit difficult in the past, getting enough resources to students without actually putting it to them in class and whatnot. But these days we have internet, access is getting better. So the learning problem is almost solving itself slowly over time. But if you look at all of these kind of platforms, like Coursera, edX, Udacity, and so on, how many of you guys have actually taken a course on one of these? Yeah, a lot of people love Coursera. Are you actually able to get a job based on, say, taking 20 courses at Coursera, right? So this is still a question, and that is not a learning question, right? That is actually a qualifications question. So this has to do with what industry and employers want out of the universities. We are having a process of academic inflation. Things which previously requires a master's now requires, degree requires a master's, and so on. We keep thinking that the higher or the more educated you are, essentially the better you are supposedly at what you're supposed to do. And these kind of things, national standardizations and whatnot, prevents the real innovations in teaching and learning. And it also prevents people to recognize self-learners. I actually know a student in my university whose only reason to take a computer science degree is because he already has a job offer in Singapore, but he cannot get a work permit there because the country doesn't let him in on a work permit basis if he doesn't have a degree. He's already excellent at program development, web development, and so on. There's actually a trainer who's actually training entrepreneurs in the country on Ruby on Rails, one of the web languages. But also the same thing, he has he's one of the premier experts in the nation, but he can't get into Singapore as well for a job which has already been offered to him, again for the same reason, right? So these are people who are self-taught, who have actually learned most of the things, and they're already experts, but these things are still getting in the way. And there's also a huge public perception that existing qualifications actually work well. So this is the question which I hope more people will ask themselves. From a degree, what do you actually know about what a person actually learned, the value of grades assigned, and the quality of a person's mind or character? In university, we are in total control of grades which we give students, right? There's such a concept as grade inflation. We have seen systematically that over time, more and more students in universities get A's, which means either that the human race is just getting smarter and smarter, amazingly, despite the fact that huge numbers of people are going to universities. And private universities have a tendency to give more A's than public universities. So if people are paying you for an education or paying you for a qualification, they better get that qualification, you know. Otherwise, not many people will actually come to your university. So these are all open questions which generally remain unresolved. So I think moving forward, technology may be able to solve some of these problems, right? Getting more information about what a student actually learns when they are in university, and getting more public interest into actually solving this problem at the roots. Not just about getting people into the workforce, not just about getting better access, but actually making sure that people who actually come out of universities are thinkers. So the relevance is, and the urgency is bigger than ever, right? Machine learning and AI is taking over our jobs very, very quickly. Clerical jobs, secretary jobs. An executive today who is very good at Google can actually maintain most of their daily experiences quite quickly with an app. You no longer need a secretary to take care of a lot of those things. We are getting translations replaced. We're getting writing company reports replaced. We're getting diagnosis of patients, identification of cancer tumors more accurately by machine algorithms than what human beings are actually capable to do. So if most of our basic thinking tasks are replaced, then we need to reach to the higher order, to the higher level of thinking as a human being in order to continue to be relevant moving forward. And we need to make sure that our kids are equipped appropriately with this as well. So this picture is actually from an anime called Neon Genesis Evangelion. I see a couple of heads nodding, right? That's actually the Magi supercomputers. What it actually does is that it runs the government of Japan in this sci-fi future, right? Where it actually polls the population, asks them for their opinions on what they actually want to experience or what they prefer, and based on that, it makes decisions and implements policies for the nation. So if anything else, running governments impartially, accurately, without interference from religious thought and whatnot, probably is one of the best things that machine learning can probably take over, right, in the near future. But yeah, how soon will that happen is an open question. So a poet once said that education is not the filling of a pail, but the lighting of a fire. I think we have lost sight of this completely. We are constantly filling the pail, and we're still doing that, and we're not lighting enough fires. So the reason why I still stick to what I do today is because of sites like this. This is a group of new students who just entered my university. They're running around doing interesting things with their seniors. And whenever I see this group of students, I ask myself, what exactly are the things that they're actually going to experience within their 3 or 4 years in a university? And the realities of what they will face makes me very, very sad indeed. And considering that I'm a geek, I always try to end every one of my presentations with a quote from Carl Sagan. Right? So we are the custodians of life's meaning. Knowledge is preferable to ignorance, and if we crave some cosmic purpose, then let us find ourselves a worthy goal. And I think education has a big part in the whole idea of finding ourselves a worthy goal, and it's something which we are not addressing. And as a society, I think we need to be more aware of what's happening, and we need to be less accepting of how we are actually allowing our students and our kids to actually experience the kind of things which they're experiencing today. Right? Thank you.
So it's time for our Q&A. So we've got questions. Yep. So let's have Willie stay here.
Okay, so let's ask questions coming from our audiences. So from our audience. So first of all, is there already a step-by-step transition plan to transform education from traditional to ideal?
A step-by-step plan. There's actually a movement called alternative education, I think, in the United States, right? There's also movements here and there, but they are not informing the larger conversation of, say, at the national level about transforming education. So making education work correctly for a lot of people, especially at the higher education level, I don't think there's in fact a step-to-step plan. So you're talking about a bunch of people who have visions of making a difference for our kids, and they are trying to apply technology in various different ways, right? Coursera is actually a very good example. They're trying to solve both the qualifications problem as well as the learning problem, right? By putting content up there and making sure people can get recognized for something that they have actually picked up on their own, right? So, but the question of whether the public are ready to accept this is still out there.
So thank you, Willie. We've got another question here. If reason can naturally lead us to realize that living for the common good should be one's life purpose, why do a lot of people, intelligent people, choose to serve themselves? Case in point, government. How do you address the gap between reason and the proper use of human freedom through education?
Right. So what I said was that basically reason should actually lead people to the conclusion that they're supposed to make a difference for mankind, right? It should do that. And if you think about it, in a lot of cases, the people who have actually gone through or had the opportunity to actually think about many of these things, they arrive at the basic conclusion, right? There's nowhere else to go, right? You either survive as a species or you die alone, right? This is essentially the basic conclusion that you can in fact draw from thinking deeply about these kind of issues. But perhaps if they are placed in positions of power or whatnot, that kind of perspective changes, right? So that may be part of human nature. But if you believe strongly enough in something, I believe that usually comes from reasoning it out with yourself. I think that's actually the more likely way which we're going to get more humanists out there in the future.
And for our last question, okay, so should the academia or the educational system always be tied to the demands of the industry or the country's economy? So should the educational system of a country should always be ready to answer whatever the economic needs of a country? Say, for example, there is a need for rapid industrialization, so we train more engineers. If there's a need for, if we are trying to build our education system, we train more teachers or quality teachers. So do you think that education should always be ready to answer whatever the country needs?
It should. That is the honest thing to do, right? When you put people into education, you are promising them a future. So part of that future is actually getting a good job and whatnot. But at the same time, which we're actually addressing our relevance to industry and so on, we should also be addressing the idea of putting our kids through experiences which are positive, right, which actually allows them to think, an experience of openness and opportunity and so on. So that conversation should happen side by side with the whole question of aligning to industry requirements and so on. And that's not happening nearly enough, right? So that conversation about changing education to create good people in the future is actually completely overshadowed by the whole career focus, preparing them for the industry and so on. So although we should do the latter, we should not forget the former as well. Right, thank you.